What if one man's dream of peace became the world's fragile hope, a whisper that roared across the ages? Imagine Moscow in 1991, a city cloaked in the gray of uncertainty, its streets humming with the tension of a nation on the brink. The Soviet Union, that sprawling giant of ideology and iron, was crumbling, its edges fraying like an old tapestry. And at the heart of it stood Mikhail Gorbachev, a name that echoes through time as both savior and sacrifice. Leader of a dying empire, visionary of a new dawn, or perhaps just a man caught in the crosshairs of fate. Here he was, in that fateful year, meeting someone in person in Moscow to discuss global peace. It's a statement so simple. Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet leader, met in person in 1991 in Moscow, discussed global peace. And yet, oh, how it pulses with the weight of 1,000 questions, 1,000 dreams. Who did he meet? What words were spoken? And why, in a world teetering on chaos, did peace feel like both the closest and most distant star in the sky? Let's wander into that Moscow of 1991, not just as historians but as travelers of the soul, seeking the threads of meaning woven into its cobblestones. The city was a paradox, a labyrinth of grand boulevards and hidden alleys where the ghosts of Stalin's purges mingled with the faint hum of a future no one could yet name. The Kremlin loomed like a silent sentinel, its red stars dimming under the weight of a dissolving dream. Picture the people, weary babushkas clutching breadlines, young dreamers whispering of freedom, soldiers with eyes that had seen too much, and Gorbachev in his office or perhaps a grand hall, his brow furrowed, his voice steady yet tinged with urgency. He was no longer the untouchable titan of 1985, when he'd first seized the reins of power. By 1991, he was a man racing against time, a conductor whose orchestra was slipping into discord. What must it have felt like to be him in that moment? To know that every word he spoke to a foreign visitor, perhaps George H.W. Bush, perhaps another, carried the hopes of a planet, yet also the shadow of his own undoing? I imagine him gazing out a window at the Moskva River, its waters sluggish and dark, reflecting a sky that refused to brighten. Did he see peace as a gift he could still offer the world, a legacy to outlast the empire he couldn't save? Or did he feel the sting of irony, that he, who'd pried open the cage of the Cold War, now watched his own nation claw its way out, leaving him behind? There's a quiet heroism in that image, a man standing at the edge of history, not with a sword, but with an outstretched hand. Let's linger on that outstretched hand for a moment, because it pulls us into the summer of 1991, a season that burned, with possibility and peril. July 29th, a date etched in the annals of diplomacy, saw Bush arrive in Moscow, his plane cutting through a sky heavy with clouds. The American leader, with his measured gait and cautious smile, stepped into a city that felt like a theater mid-act, its script torn and rewritten daily. 2 days later, on July 31st, they sat together, Gorbachev and Bush, surrounded by aides, translators, and the invisible weight of decades of enmity. They signed START 1, a treaty that promised to carve away 30% of the nuclear arsenals that had haunted the world since Hiroshima. Imagine the air in that room, electric with the gravity of it all, yet softened by a shared breath of relief. 2 men, 2 nations, choosing to dismantle the tools of annihilation rather than wield them. Isn't that a marvel, a defiance of the darker angels of our nature? But what did they say beyond the ink and paper? I picture Gorbachev leaning forward, his voice low but insistent. George, we cannot let this chance slip away. The world is watching, and history will judge us. Bush, ever the realist, might have nodded, replying, Mikhail, I agree, but we must be sure. Peace is a promise we can't afford to break. They spoke of the Gulf War, fresh in memory with its plumes of oil smoke still staining the desert, sky, of the Soviet economy, A sinking ship, Gorbachev begged the West to buoy. Of the Baltic states, whose cries for independence rang like bells tolling the end of an era. It was a dialogue of giants, yet also of men, flawed, hopeful, burdened by the crowns they wore. I feel a thrill imagining it, a rush of wonder at how close we came to a different world. Yet the philosophical heart of this moment beats louder than the treaties or titles. Gorbachev wasn't just negotiating with Bush, he was wrestling with destiny itself. He'd spent years preaching new thinking, a gospel of cooperation over confrontation, a belief that humanity could shed its tribal skins and embrace a shared horizon. But what is peace, really? Is it the silence of weapons, or the roar of justice rising from the ashes of oppression? John Locke once mused, "The end of government is the good of mankind." Did Gorbachev see himself as a shepherd of that good, not just for Soviets but for all? I can't shake the image of him as a modern Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods of war to light a path for us all, only to be chained by the very people he sought to free. And what of the world beyond that Moscow room? Let's pull the lens wider, because 1991 wasn't just Gorbachev's story. It was a tapestry of voices, a chorus of longing and loss. In Vilnius, Lithuanian protesters had faced Soviet tanks in January, their blood staining the snow as they sang of liberty. In Berlin, the wall's echoes still reverberated, a wound healed but not forgotten. In Baghdad, the scars of Operation Desert Storm smoldered, a reminder that peace in one corner often meant war in another. Gorbachev's meeting in Moscow wasn't an island, it was a ripple in a vast, churning sea. Did he feel those ripples, I wonder? Did he hear the distant cries of those who saw his reforms as both blessing and curse? Let's drift into the minds of those around him too, the unsung players in this drama. Imagine a young aide, perhaps named Sasha, scribbling notes as Gorbachev and Bush spoke. Sasha's hands tremble, not from nerves, but from the realization that his children might grow up in a world without the shadow of nuclear winter. Or picture a Kremlin cook, Maria, stirring borscht in a steamy kitchen, whispering prayers that her son, drafted into a fracturing army, might never fire a shot. These are the souls who carried 1991 on their backs, whose dreams and fears wove the fabric of Gorbachev's vision. I feel their presence like a heartbeat, a reminder that history isn't just made by leaders, it's lived by the leadee. But the story doesn't pause in July. August arrived like a thief, stealing Gorbachev's momentum with a coup that shook the world. Hardliners, men of steel hearts and clenched fists, locked him away in Crimea, their tanks rolling through Moscow's streets as if to crush his dreams under treads. For 3 days, August 19th to 21, the city held its breath, barricades rising, Yeltsin atop a tank, defiance in the air. The coup failed, but when Gorbachev returned, he was a king without a crown. Can you feel the ache of that fall? A man who'd faced down the specter of war, now humbled by his own comrades, his voice drowned by the clamor of a new Russia. By December, the Soviet Union was gone, its hammer and sickle lowered for the last time, its dissolution signed in a Belarusian forest far from Moscow's gaze. How does one bear such a loss? I see Gorbachev standing alone, the wind whistling, through a Kremlin emptied of its empire, and my heart twists for him. Yet let's not bury the light of that July meeting under the rubble of December. Start. I wasn't just a document, it was a seed, planted in soil still warm with hope. It grew into later treaties, into a world where children born after 1991, like me, like you, perhaps, never knew the dread of duck-and-cover drills. I think of my own childhood, far from Moscow's chill, where the word peace felt like a given, not a gift. Did Gorbachev know he was writing that future? Did he sense that his handshake with Bush would echo beyond the Soviet Union's? grave, a melody of possibility for generations yet to come. Now, let's wander into the shadows of that triumph, because no story of peace is complete without its thorns. The Soviet Union's end wasn't a clean break, it was a fracture that birthed new wars. Chechnya bled, Yugoslavia shattered, and the post-Soviet sphere became a chessboard of power and pain. Gorbachev's dream of global peace, did it falter here, in the ashes of his own nation? I wrestle with that question, feeling the sting of its complexity. Perhaps peace is a phoenix, rising only after fire has consumed what came before. Or perhaps it's a mirage, always shimmering just beyond our reach, as Sartre might argue. Man is condemned to be free, free to chase ideals, but never to hold them fully. Let's imagine Gorbachev years later, in the quiet of retirement, reflecting on 1991. I see him in a modest dacha, the wind rustling through pines, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. Does he smile at the memory of that Moscow meeting, or does he sigh at what followed? "I gave them freedom," he once said, "and they didn't know what to do with it." There's a raw truth in that, a confession that cuts to the bone. Freedom and peace. Twin sisters, yet so often at odds. I feel a surge of tenderness for him, this man who dared to dream beyond the Iron Curtain, who stood in Moscow and said, "Let us try." Isn't that the essence of the human spirit? To try, even when the odds tower like mountains. Let's stretch further into the unseen corners of that year. In a Moscow apartment, a poet named Olga pens verses about the summit, her ink staining the page with hope. The bombs sleep tonight, their silence a hymn. In a factory, a worker named Ivan toasts with vodka, muttering, "Maybe my son won't die for nothing." These are the ripples we rarely see, the lives touched by a moment in the Kremlin. I feel their weight, their warmth, and it pulls me deeper into Gorbachev's story, not as a leader, but as a man whose choices rippled outward, touching souls he'd never meet. Now, let's circle back to the philosophical core, because this tale demands it. Gorbachev's 1991 was a crucible of the human condition. Hope and despair, power and fragility, all melted together. Kant once wrote, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." Gorbachev's peace was crooked, imperfect, yet it bent toward something greater. Was he naive to think one meeting could heal a fractured world? Or was his naivety his strength, a refusal to bow to cynicism? I lean toward the latter, because there's a wild beauty in his defiance, a spark that says, "Even if I fall, let it be reaching." And reach he did, across borders, across ideologies, across time itself. That Moscow meeting, July or otherwise, was a bridge, a fragile span between what was and what could be. It's a bridge I walk now, in these words, feeling the creak of its planks underfoot. What does it mean to us, decades later? Are we still building on Gorbachev's foundation, or have we let it crumble? Distracted by new wars, new walls, I look at the world today, its drones, its divisions, and I wonder, did we squander his gift? Or is peace, like love, a labor that never ends, a garden that demands constant tending? Let me paint one final scene, because this story deserves it. It's dusk in Moscow, 1991, the day after the meeting. Gorbachev stands on a balcony, the city sprawling below, its lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. The wind carries the scent of rain, the murmur of a people restless for change. He closes his eyes, and for a moment, he's not a leader, just Mikhail, a boy from Stavropol who once dreamed under a vast sky. "Did I do enough?" he whispers to the night. The night doesn't answer, but the stars do, winking through the clouds as if to say, "You tried, and that's enough." So here we are, you and I, at the end of this journey through 1991. Gorbachev's Moscow moment, be it with Bush or another, was a spark in a darkening world, a cry for meaning in a chorus of chaos. It's a story of treaties and tanks, of hope and heartbreak, of a man who dared to dream when others built walls. What does it stir in you? Do you see a hero, a fool, or something in between? For me, he's a reminder that peace isn't a destination. It's a struggle, a song we sing even when our voices break. As Rumi once wrote, "Beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." Gorbachev stood in that field in 1991, arms open, waiting. Will we join him?